And yeah, so today we're going to be talking specifically about earthquakes and what that means, what they do, how to survive one of them, and also talk about media that covers earthquakes and their effects. There's quite a lot of earthquake-specific films that exist. I would say some of these other, like, natural disasters, it was hard to find media for because like people aren't really taking it seriously, or they were like funny things. But today we're going to be talking about the anime Japan Sinks 2020, which, you know, was far from comfort TV during the pandemic. It is definitely not that. It was also affected by the pandemic in some ways. Specifically in that there was supposed to be mention of the 2020 Olympics in Japan, and they were like, that's delayed.
Yeah, that didn't happen.
We can't, that's not, which is super real, right? And to think like a different kind of, you know, event could occur that's so dramatic instead of, you know, Japan Sings 2020. But yeah, why don't we jump in to our content? We're doing things a little differently from what you might have seen last month with our guests. We're going to start with our film analysis, and then we're going to dive into Cat section, where we'll actually talk about, like, what is an earthquake? What does it do? How do you survive?
Why be scared?
Yeah, why is it terrifying? Because it truly is. So let's talk about the media for today's episode. So the first thing is the film we're going to talk about. An earthquake in New Orleans opens up a series of fissures around the city. A family discovers there is a greater danger at hand. A species of giant, fire-breathing spiders has evolved deep underground, and the seismic activity has awoken them from hibernation and allowed them to cause mayhem on the surface. That's not Japan Sinks 2020. That is Arachnoquake, which is absurd. Absurd. One of these. There are so many ridiculous films in which there's some type of natural disaster that awakens or changes the way that certain creatures exist. And in this case, it's fire-breathing spiders, which is not the only instance of fire-breathing spiders that we'll probably hear about. But I thought that was fun because I was like, oh, it's so fun. That is not what.
That's so. I just feel like any fire-breathing spiders, even if it's a funny movie, I would be so horrified the entire time.
Yeah. It's not.
100%.
It's not. It's absurd, and I can't imagine what it looks like on screen. But I think it would be really fun to play in that, to be like, oh, the fire-breathing spider. Like,
yeah, should be an actress.
Crawling with giant spiders.
Oh my God. What part of jumbo spiders don't you understand?
Time to show Daddy Longlegs how we roll on the bayou.
And how rude, you know, like you're trying to survive, there is an earthquake, everything you know and love is dead, and now there's also spiders? Like, why? Rude.
The breathe fire.
Like not even just normal spiders that are terrifying. Yeah, exactly. But here's a real summary. I hope you guys had fun with that one. Japan Sinks 2020. An ordinary family is put to the test as a series of massive earthquakes throw Japan into total mayhem. From director Masaki Yuasa, who also did Devilman Crybaby, but I like to say Devilman because it's fun. And this is the first anime adaptation of the best-selling science fiction novel by Sakio Komatsu, which I will talk about at length. But it is, I'd actually kind of recognize the art from Devilman Crybaby, but it was like, I've only watched like 2 episodes because it's a lot. Crybaby is a lot to deal with. I pitched it loosely for our anime section, but just couldn't figure out a way to weave it in to the way that we approach media. Yeah. But it's fun, and this is like so different from that in the way that like it's more realistic in the way that the art is happening, because Devilman gets really weird. Like there's this really strange like body movements and the way that, you know, the body is portrayed. It's kind of body horror in a lot of ways.
Gotcha.
But he, you know, he also took on this, which is based on that. It's one of many adaptations of the novel by Komatsu. So this is a rather heartbreaking anime that cuts to the heart of the effect of natural disasters on people. Kat like offhandedly mentioned, she actually spoiled in an earlier episode. I don't remember which one it was, so I'm sorry for anyone who did it. She spoiled something.
That's real. That sounds like something I would do.
In like episode 2, I think it was, where you were like, oh, and then this thing happens. And I was like, what? And so when I watched it, I knew that was going to happen, but I was still absolutely just like, that is so rude.
Devastating.
This is the way this happened.
Yeah.
Like, you cannot do this to me. It's really, like I said, heartbreaking, and you feel really intimately connected to the family, and it's an honest portrayal of what happens during that I felt was really authentic, because, you know, a lot of the times in disaster films, we spend a lot of it like running from the thing, or the majority of it, like next week we'll see, is like people avoiding the truth, and then it happens and it's like, oh, you know, and we only get like 5 seconds in the trauma. Whereas this, because it's a TV show, it takes a lot more time. We can spend more time with the characters, and the fact that it's still going, like it's not just one event, it's several events, and they all have like these repercussions and other things that come from it, like earthquakes are the cause of like everything. So there's this bigger thing that's happening. So we get to spend a lot more time with our characters, dealing with a lot of the trauma surrounded with it, which is super authentic and great. Like I said, it is adapted from the novel Japan Sinks by Sakio Komatsu, but it does take a different approach from the book, in that the book was kind of created as a warning about imminent disasters that await Japan, which Kat will explain in her section, like what those horrors are. Yes. Like what it is very real. And that's what you'll find, like, you know, in this section and also in the film too, is that this is not like just fun and games. We're not making, you know, putting The Rock in a San Francisco movie about earthquakes just to show cool effects. Like, this is real. This is actually a scientific, you know, representation of the truth, so that we can, you know, educate people. But the novel specifically, it's backwards on but the novel specifically follows the scientists and the politicians who are dealing with the earthquake, and the impending earthquakes, and kind of the politics that go along with kind of talking through the possibility of it, and, you know, the delaying tactics and all the things that go through it. So similar to like Bong Joon-ho's The Host, the TV show Chernobyl, which we talked about briefly at some point, and even Godzilla, which counts as an earthquake film. Look it up, Godzilla is an earthquake film. Those all seek to like explore how governments or like the higher ups are handling the natural disaster. So it's like, what decisions are being made from up here to like save the people, or, you know, not acknowledge the dangers that are right in front of us, even though the scientists are telling you. Like, there's so many, like, this really reminds me of Chernobyl, where like the first few episodes are them being like, this is going to happen, it is dangerous, it is scary, and then it's like, it is happening, it has happened, what are we going to do? And people being like, it's nothing happened, there's nothing to be worried about, what are you talking about? And so the book was similar to that. So we'll also see in like next week's episode about how, you know, they'll also delay certain reactions because they don't want to alarm people and they want to avoid panic. And so then like the scientists or the people who are, you know, calling it out often get gaslit or dismissed, because it's like, no, you're overreacting. There's no way that something that big could happen. Or, oh yeah, something that big could happen, but it's not happening now. Right? And it's like, yeah, but it is. Let's talk about it. So the first thing I want to unpack in this series is, does the content that we're covering accurately represent the horrors of a natural disaster? And so I found in an article on the NYU Gallatin from writer Naho Sakami, explains the novel's influence on the differences between the novel and the show. And so it's titled Japan Sinks. And in it, it explains that Komatsu's novel was actually really timely in that it served the purpose of informing the public of the very real threat of an impending earthquake. So in the article, they say that Komatsu, began writing his story in 1964, which collides with the first science journal publication on seafloor spreading and continental drift. And 1969 was the first article published on plate tectonics. It was only in the middle of the 1970s that the Japanese geological community gradually began to accept plate tectonic theory, and it took another decade for it to become widely accepted. So this takes place in the 1970s. So he was like at the head of the game of being like, this is something that is being scientifically proven and people aren't hearing about it like right away. And so Komatsu's decision to follow a scientist, specifically struggling to get government officials to listen and seriously consider the impending disaster, is strategic. Like, it was the point of actually critiquing what was happening in real life at the time. And because at that time, it was very likely that many would dismiss or misunderstand the gravity of the situation. Sakami, the writer of this article, goes on to explain that this explains why Komatsu presented Tadakoro, which is the scientist in the novel, as a geophysicist that studied abroad instead of a geologist. In Japan's sinks, Tadakoro was laughed at by the cabinet members and other Japanese scholars, and the only reason they do not entirely dismiss his idea is because he must be smart, since he is recognized by the U.S. science community. Japan Sinks presents real-life conflicts and differences in scientific understanding. In terms of the general public's understanding, Japan Sinks must have played a huge role in spreading the knowledge of plate tectonics through millions of copies sold and viewed in theaters. So as far as like, all of that is to say, is this accurate in its representation? Yes, because the whole point of it was to inform the public about this natural disaster in a way that would be understandable for them. So yes, it was being in scientific journals, but there was a different way to show that, get that information to the public, as well as, get ahead of any kind of pushback to be like, government, if you're going to push back on us about what we're showing you, we already predicted that you were going to do that in this book. So, I also, unlike most disaster media, where the science and the actual event kind of take a backseat to the people-focused plots, the book and the many adaptations that followed were intending to do both. Where it was like, this is very heavily science related, but it also shows how people are going to react to the situation. And it shows us the truth of what lurks beneath our feet and explores the effects it has on humanity. The other thing I want to unpack for this series is what this film or media is trying to tell us about humanity, because that's the gist of what we do here. So in Japan Sinks 2020, it decides to it takes a completely different route in that it decides to ignore the higher-ups completely and instead focuses on a specific family that is fighting to survive. And so in an article that I found on Asahi Shimbun, titled "In 2020 Reboots of Japan Sinks, the Disaster is No Longer the Star" by Atsushi Ohara, it goes on to talk about director Masaki Yuasa in his decision to change our story's protagonists from the scientists who are in the higher-ups who are making these executive decisions and actually put us right in the middle of the action to the people who are being affected by it. And so he said, "The original novel confronted Japan with fear at a time when the country was living it up. But now, after we experienced the 2011 earthquake, the fear is real," Yuasa said. "So I thought I should portray how people think and live in a world where Japan has sunk, instead of taking an omniscient point of view." So seeing exactly what people are way more aware of now in 2021 than they were in 1970, because we have already experienced those natural disasters on a smaller scale than what is predicted, but it's like we know even what these small ones can do. And he also goes on to say, "I thought it would be realistic when people have no time to accept the deaths of their loved ones and have no choice but to flee from the spot, feeling the sorrow and fear that comes afterward." Because, through their experiences, that we as the audience get to see the heart of the issue that arises from natural disasters, which is the anxiety and fear and the loss of your community and your home and the people that you care about and the fact that you have to just keep going. And that was like really impactful as a viewer to watch, because like we have to live these experiences alongside the Mutos, and live in the same anxiety as them. Like we don't even know who's going to survive, and no one is safe. Like there are protagonists that are the head of this story who die, and just die in these really graphic and honestly like traumatic ways. Like I was capital STRESSED. I was stressed like the whole time because I was just like, what? Like no one is safe, and you're forced, because especially in binge culture, right, to kind of consume the whole thing. So you're also kind of rushing as well, because you want to know what's next. Like you're like, I need to know how they're going to get from point A to point B. And I think Yuasa does an incredible job of moving us forward through the action and showing the vulnerability of people fighting to survive. Because we see people die in these like brutal, quick, shocking ways. And because we have to keep moving forward, like we alongside them don't even get a moment to grieve. So there's a lot of times where they are just pushing forward, and they have to kind of put aside their survivor's guilt and those moments that they could have took to grieve and just move forward and try to survive. And we're also doing that. And I think there was a very human way to portray these characters that like, because, you know, the mom in this is like awesome. She's phenomenal as a mom. And there are times where, you know, she has this disagreement with her daughter because she isn't grieving like a character the way that the daughter feels like she should. And it was super real to be like, I have to take care of you. Like, I can't feel bad. I can't be sad. Like, we have to survive. And I know it seems like I'm being insensitive, but I literally have to shut off that part of me in order for us to move forward. I also think, like, you know, last month we talked about the beauty in anime showing us this ability to give us emotional and realistic villains, right? And in this, the bigger villain is, you know, the earthquake, right? But I think the show actually shows even more real villains in that it shows our fellow humans who are adapting and reacting to the trauma. Because I think what hit me the most when watching the show was not the natural disaster or even the deaths, which were quite impactful. Instead, I found myself caught up in the idea specifically of Japanese identity, which I was not expecting when I came in. I was like, oh, I'm so emotional. There's this family. I get it. But there's all this little weaving in of what the Japanese culture is and what these Japanese people are experiencing, and just Japan as a whole, because it is Japan sinks, right? Like, it's not just like, oh, a natural disaster happened. Japan is sinking. Like, it is going to be gone. And so there is a strong critique against nationalism. And if you're familiar with our show here at the Ghouls, we're strongly against nationalism most of the time, because it can be really toxic and harmful. And we, you know, believe we're all one people, and that if we can set aside those things. But there's another part to that in just being, you know, proud and acknowledging your culture and history and loving it and appreciating it, and then being like harmful to other people because they're not that. Right? Like they're, you know, and I think this show really approaches both sides of that coin really well. There are so many instances where we see these harmful ideologies at play, like including a ship that won't allow anyone who isn't a full-blooded Japanese person on it, excluding our entire protagonist group because they're a mixed family, because the mom is from the Philippines. So in that same article with Asahi Shimbun, Ohara goes on to say that the series, which introduces the character of Ayumi's mother as an energetic, optimistic woman from the Philippines, also doesn't flinch from the dark side of Japanese society, with scenes depicting discrimination against non-Japanese characters and Japanese trying to exclude them, which happens quite a lot. And I think, like, though we are, you know, given that look at some of those toxic ideologies and, like, people who are like, this is the perfect way to be, and if you're not that, then you're out. It kind of reminded me of the Blood Quantum, where we were talking about, like, you're stacking the pebbles, and it's like they're, you know, that's not the same effect. That's how I felt when I was watching them, is like that they're saying, like, you're reducing us to pebbles. But we also see a critique on the loss of Japanese culture and pride, specifically with the character Go, which is the youngest member of this family, who's like this little nerdy boy who loves social media and technology, and is really appreciative of Western culture and has aspirations to leave Japan, and it has all these like offhanded comments about how Japan is like not that great quite often, and like he just doesn't like it. He's also mixed, and so he probably has some effects from people that like off screen probably had to deal with that as well. But I think like even with him and in his interactions throughout the show, he is interacting with characters who are proud of their Japanese heritage, and they kind of instill that in him. Like, you should be proud of this. Like, you should be proud of this sumo wrestler, or you should be proud of the like, you should enjoy the food. You just didn't have the food right. Yeah. You know, like those kinds of things. And to show him, and by extension, the audience, what to value in this Japanese culture, because it is at risk of being lost forever. And so I think even like in the end, when we see there's an attempt to rebuild, there's intentionality in preserving the beauty and history of Japanese culture, which would just be lost with the island, which is another critique in in that, like, if we keep ourselves, you know, in our little islands and remote and away from the rest of the world, then we're also going to be away from the rest of the world when there is danger, and that we're at risk of losing everything by being so exclusive. When I'm watching this, I was thinking of the tactic in war when they like burn down libraries or museums and things like that, to like kind of like, that's a tactic. It's literally there to like erase your country's history and what made your country that, like your memories of your country. And Japan Sings 2020 has this really great way of blending and having this balance between criticizing the toxicity of nationalism, which only has praise without criticism of your country, and with that discrimination of the other, and like this push for the need of an appreciation and an understanding of one's culture, which is like a hard thing to do both. Yeah. And I found that very inherent in the work. Another big departure from the novel, which is due specifically to the time in which it takes place, because the novel and other adaptations, which are direct adaptations from the book, take place in the 1970s. And this takes place in 2020. So, of course, there's going to be a difference. The big difference is that they use social media and technology as a means of connecting people. So we have a character who quickly becomes a favorite, I think, who is a YouTuber. Right. And he's like, I was wary of him. And he was a big surprise being how smart and fun and sweet he was, because not to generalize, but people often associate YouTubers with culturally insensitive brats who kind of exploit other countries for clout. Think Logan Paul when he went to the Aokigahara forest and recorded some really sensitive things there with no understanding of the culture. Whereas Kato in this show has an intense appreciation for Japan and the other places that he visits, even more so than Go at times, where he's like, you don't even know how amazing your country is. And I'm going to tell you, because as an outsider, I can see that. You know, I can see what the beauty is because I don't have that. You know, and also simultaneously being like, here's some things from where I come from. It's beautiful and great, but it's not the only thing. Like, there's beauty everywhere. And I think that was really amazing. He was like a breath of fresh air during this. I was like so worried. But technology plays a really important part in this, in keeping people informed and connected. So videos and photos are used to preserve Japanese culture and history, but are also there to hold the memories of the people that we lost and kind of recreate them. Like we talked about in one of our apps episode about resurrecting loved ones through technology. It's like we put so much of ourselves online and in these photos that we can preserve life in a way. Like we can revisit people we care about in this very unique way using technology. But on the other side of just preserving memories, it's also used as a form of information gathering. So people use Twitter and other social media to get information of what's happening around them so that they can make decisions to communicate with one another and strategize towards survival. Because it's like, okay, the left of this island is danger. That's what they're saying on Twitter. Oh, we're getting news that we should go to X location because there's someone there. And the only reason they can do that is because they have social media, which is phenomenal. And it's like, again, that's only going to happen with the fact that it exists in 2020. Another article that I found, or well, actually Kat found, thank you, Kat, is on Thrillist, and it's titled Netflix Disaster Anime Japan Sinks 2020 is the Perfect Metaphor for This Bad Year. And it is by Campbell, and in it they explain that by the end, the show's critique of Japanese nationalism as the real doom of Japan is crystal clear. The archaic desire for isolationism and purity not only meaning death in the short term, but in the long term too. The series posits that without connection, there is no memory, and without memory, death is truly the end. A lot of that memory is enabled through digital technology, which here mostly exists as a way of personal connection, remembrance, photos, and videos becoming loaded with meaning and history. Especially in a time where a lot of people are holding together through the usage of such digital communication, Japan Sinks truly hits home. And that's to speak to the fact that we're currently living in a time where we're all connecting to one another because of technology and are able to do this virtual thing. Like people are not in my face. Kat is not in front of me, but she is in the way that we're able to be close to technology. But I think overall, though this is taking place 50 years after the original media, the horrors of an earthquake destroying Japan, threatening to erase its history and culture, and the impact it has on human lives hasn't changed much at all. Like the bear, like that bear part of the story is still very much there. It's just how do we react? What do we find more important? What can we do to change it? How can we continue to find hope? And, you know, I think the powers that be are still more likely to dismiss and delay information to avoid panic. That's just kind of what comes with that. And I think mostly is that this media, the Japan Sinks 2020, is doing the same thing that the book sought out to do, which is be used as a tool for education. Only this time, it's not just the scientific and political horrors, but also the personal ones. And I think what we can learn from this anime that the novel and other adaptations missed is that humanity can prevail and that there is hope and we can support one another and grow and rebuild it. Because we have that technology, right? Because that's what they use in the end is like, we can replicate what we lost with the historical, like, like the feeds. Like we're using everyone's social media to recreate what this place looks like. Like we wouldn't have that in 1970. So I think that's one thing that's like super hopeful and cool. And I really loved about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's also like interesting. You have like this, the science really plays a part, and then like there is a way, as you said, to like preserve it. But that I was when you're talking about Twitter, I was really thinking about how like during the protests, Twitter and like Instagram were used as like ways to communicate roads that were like blocks that were safe, like that didn't have heavy police presence, and that it's all very like quick and live, so you're able to really track where things are going. So that's, I mean, outside of your phone battery dying, like it is a really useful tool in disaster or emergency scenarios to really like stay connected with what's happening. And that's both positive and can be really overwhelming, as I think like you and I can both attest to from the start of the pandemic. Like I would spend hours looking at articles on updates on like what's happening. But that became like kind of like obsessive. Yeah, exactly. But it can become kind of obsessive when you're dealing with like the shock of the initial issue. But yeah, this media does a really good job at showing it, and was really stressful. It made me cry more than once.
Yeah, I cried. I legit cried. I was like, this is so... I had to take breaks in between certain episodes and like put in something happy for a minute because I was like, whew, I think after like the one episode that you spoiled, Kat, we actually took like, I want to say several weeks before we jump back in. Because I was just like, I don't know if emotionally I'm in a good place to watch this. You really have to be prepared for sadness.
Yeah, it's very heavy. It's definitely very real and very heavy in that like the tragedy is very human tragedy. Like, and death happens as unexpectedly as death happens in real life. and when characters are lost, you kind of just have this like the show does a really good job, as you were talking about, like showing how like you don't even get a second to fully grasp the loss that just happened, and you just kind of have to keep going.